Hello, everyone. I am very much looking forward to a juicy conversation today with Julie Harris. She is the founder of Green Oak. Julie, welcome.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me.
So tell me, I think a lot of practice owners will be familiar with Green Oak and maybe you, but would love for you to explain the basics as well as what is the single most important truth about their financials? If you could communicate one of those to group practice owners, what would it be?
Okay, so I'm going to start there and say every practice deserves to be profitable. You need money in this capitalistic world that we live in, right? It's like there has to be money. You have to make some money in order for the business to survive ultimately, right? Like there's no magic fountain of money coming to save you. And so building a profitable practice is in service to everyone around you, including your clients. And so I believe in doing that as a not selfish thing that is ultimately to your benefit as well as the owner. And you should get rewarded for building this business. But a little bit about me. I'm Julie Harris. I'm the founder of Green Oak Accounting. We are a firm that works with therapy practices all across the United States. And we have done so for the last decade. So we've seen under the hood of thousands of practices at this point. We've seen what makes them work and not financially. And so I've got some pretty strong opinions on what can make a practice financially successful. At least I'm an accountant. I'm not a therapist. I think my role in the world is to help the helpers. And so I just look at it from the lens of like, there has to be profit in the business. So how do we ultimately do that? And that's the work that we do at Green Oak.
Before we delve deeper into all that good
Yeah.
stuff, what is the origin story of how you ended up picking mental health as your vertical?
Yeah. When I first started my firm, I was a generalist. So we had kind of clients of restaurants and solar panel companies, a little bit of everything. And I realized really quickly on, I had a very small team that in order to do the kind of really deep work that I wanted to do, like really, really help our clients, I could not know everything about every industry. That was just not going to be possible. And so we decided pretty early on to specialize. And when we internally thought about like, who are the clients that we really, really love working with? There are a couple people who came up, but specifically one of our therapist clients who was referring a lot of other therapists to us is still a client to this day. And we just really loved working with them. Therapists are highly educated, very, very smart, but just don't know hardly anything about accounting usually or the financial side of private practice. And so they were hungry for that information and they were actually listening to our advice. And so I tend to hire people who have the heart of a teacher. We are happy to teach. We want people to understand what's going on in their business. So that was just a really, really good fit for us. And as we got that message out, like we just kept getting more and more referrals for therapists, and that just became our thing.
I think teaching is important. Definitely both the sort of academic stuff that someone might be taught in an accounting class, someone might be taught about financial statements, and I think there's teaching to do, in my experience, around boundaries. I think a lot of practice owners would not mind me saying that they tend to be very generous, big-hearted people, and some clinicians do take advantage of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think as the accounting partner, because we understand the industry so deeply, we can also sometimes play the role of the bad guy, right? When you are maybe going into a conversation about compensation, which is what we're talking about today, you can tell your clinician like, well, our accountant, we've talked to our accountant, we've run the numbers, like this is the best that we can do. And it kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off of that situation.
So do you actually participate in those conversations, or are you just the bad guy that
Yeah, we're not actively participating in that conversation. We are definitely participating in the preparation for that conversation, right? Looking at the numbers, what is possible, what makes financial sense, looking at the history and just the comps as well for the rest of the team. But the owner is the one who has to go in and have that tough conversation on their own. Yeah, we're just the bad guy.
any more advice for how owners can learn to set those boundaries and have those conversations?
Yeah, it takes a lot of practice, right? It's not easy and it doesn't always get easier even. But you just, I think as an owner, learn how to do it when you just get in there and do it. Also, the first time you have a team member that you have bent over backwards for and given everything to, the first time you have someone like that leave, it kind of hardens the owner a little bit, right? So there's some things that we can tell you, but until you actually experience it, you won't know it in quite the same visceral way, right? But the first time that happens to you, you've given someone everything and bent over backwards and really kind of done things that you knew you should not do, and they're still leaving you to go somewhere else to make, a couple dollars more per hour, or sometimes it's not even any more money. It just kind of changes something in you. You're like, you know what? I cannot please everyone, and I'm gonna have to be okay with sometimes it's gonna work and sometimes it's just time for people to go. And I've got to build a business that doesn't depend on any one specific person staying forever. And that's ultimately a good thing for the business.
I was going to say it may ultimately be a real boon because it clears up so much space, so much energy.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And when that person is kind of taking that your mental load, some of that energy, like it having them leave can sometimes feel hard, but also be beneficial to the practice where you realize like, yep, it was the right thing. I should not have done that. Now we can realign on an even keel for everyone.
So let's say that I'm a practice owner. I've now created the space. Someone that I was paying an 80% split to is now
Yeah.
gone. How should I do things differently? How should I determine what a fair but also sustainable compensation structure for my
Yeah.
clinicians is?
Yeah. I think the key word here is sustainable. I think mental health should be reimbursed at much higher rates, right? Like I'm an advocate. I think the insurance reimbursements are insufficient right now, but they are also the reality, right? And we live out here in the real world. And so when we look at the pie basically that is the income of the practice, my general recommendation is that no more than 45 to 60% of that should go to clinical payroll. And I get a lot of pushback on that. I get a lot of sometimes hate online for that. Like I get a lot of strongly worded messages, let's just say. But that is the reality, right? Like when we keep numbers within that range, I know with certainty that you can run a profitable practice. I know that that is possible. And that 60%, it includes wages, payroll tax, and benefits. So that's a lot. That's a lot of things that have to fit within that. But that means we usually have 20% left for kind of all of your overhead items, right? Your administrative costs, your operating expenses, your rents, like all the things that come with running the practice. And then about 20% for profit, which is a solid place to be. But it's so easy, right? Like in accounting, when you have 100% of a pie, you can only spend 100% of the money that you make, right? So if you're taking part of it away, it has to come from somewhere. Like if you are paying your clinicians 65%, usually that just means there's no more than 15% profit. And that's a business that is tougher to run because there's little margin, right? 15 turns into 11, turns into 9 really easily. And it's harder to sell because those are not great margins as well.
I think a lot of clinicians that run insurance-based practices would be pretty happy if they had 20% pre-tax profits. That's not a bad place to shoot for.
I mean, it's a good place to be, and that's generally what we are recommending that our owners aim for that. That doesn't mean that everyone is there, but we know it's very much possible, right? It is possible still in 2026 for that to happen. It's not accidental though. It is very intentional what you do in your practice to get to that place. It is not an accident.
What are some of the highest leverage, sort of low-hanging fruit things that practice owners can do to start to move in that direction?
Yeah. Well, when I share that guideline, a lot of times, the owners will assume like, oh, well, I have this really experienced person. Like I couldn't possibly, right? So first of all, I couldn't possibly, that's not true. Like you have to do what is right for the business. But I'm not necessarily saying that every single person on your team has to be at the same rate, right? That's not realistic. That's not necessarily the case. But if you have someone that's highly experienced at a higher rate, you usually are going to have to offset that with someone else who's at a lower rate. Maybe they're earlier in their career. Maybe they are an associate, right? There's a lot of different ways to do that. But if we look at least at the average, I would like for that to be under 60% so that it stays sustainable. But when everyone is at that higher rate, it's just really hard to do. And I've seen, Dan, over the years, like I've seen as high as 100%, someone being paid 100% of what they made. Yes, they had other duties, but still like that does not make financial sense, at least. There may be some reasons for someone to do that are non-financial, but it does not make any financial sense. You would be better off not having that person on your team. You would actually make more money.
100-0 split.
100%. I have seen that more than once.
That is a remarkable, remarkable thing. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So how often, I'm curious, I know that you specialize in behavioral health.
Yeah.
In other realms of healthcare, do you have any sense as to how likely something like that is to happen? Like, how would you compare the generosity of behavioral health practice owners to others?
Yeah. Well, in other specialties, like if we think of physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech and language, right? Even just as adjacent to behavioral health, we're usually looking at cost of clinical payroll under 50%, right? So like just immediately going adjacent, you're seeing a really big shift very, very quickly, right? And if we look at other industries, even in professional services, often that cost of labor is in the 30 to 40% range, right? If we're thinking of marketing or other, service-based businesses. So it's not, I think it's the fact that it's so high in mental and behavioral health is a product of just how low the reimbursement rates are, right? But also, there's this sense of entitlement or sense of duty to clinicians often like, oh, well, how could I possibly pay them under 50%? Like that's done all the time in many, many industries, and it's not even a big deal. But it's also usually not as directly tied to, if you do this, I'm going to pay you this much, right? It's kind of in a different format, and that's why it's not as noticeable. But just the way that compensation works generally um, in this industry, that's kind of how we end up here, in part because you cannot possibly see, most people cannot see 40 clients a week, right? As a therapist, like that's just not
Yeah.
reasonable. And so we've got to find a way to really make 20 to 25 hours of billable work, cover all of your expenses. And that's a hard thing to do as well. So there's just a lot of things working against therapists in this case. Yeah.
Work can be emotionally demanding. So you're right, it's going to be extremely tricky. Of what the definition of a full-time caseload isn't what it might be in some other realms. And you factor in that we can talk about percentages and we can talk about absolute dollar amounts, right?
Exactly.
And those absolute dollar amounts just aren't what we would wish they would be. Definitely, if time permitting, we could get back to the question of advocacy, which is something that I find really, really interesting as well, and how we can potentially get those rates up in a realm where we might have rollback of the parity rule, which would be really unfortunate. Really unfortunate. But maybe just delving deeper into the world where we are. When we talk about compensation here, one of the spicier questions that comes up that I actually think about quite a lot is whether practice owners should be transparent with their clinicians, both in terms of what others and they are making, as well as the overall finances of the practice. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I actually, on my podcast, Therapy for Your Money, I have a fairly recent episode on that specific topic. But the gist of it, Dan, is I don't think most people in your practice deserve to know everything that's going on. I don't think they have necessarily the business maturity to understand what it means. And I'm not saying like emotional maturity, right? But really, a non-owner is going to have a hard time understanding all the risk involved with the business, right? The fact that the owner is ultimately responsible for a 10-year lease and all this risk and clawbacks that may come, 18 months after a clinician has left, and you can't claw back payroll, right? And so they're not necessarily understanding of the risk, but they just see kind of profit as like, oh, look at that, so and so's going to go buy a Mercedes because of my work, and not understanding that profit has some really heavy lifting to do. It's what pays taxes for the business. It's what pays the business owner, but it's also what's used for expansion and growth and ultimately gets reinvested in the business. And they just don't have that understanding. So I think if you have a practice with, 25 clinicians and you've got a clinical director or someone who's really a right hand who's overseeing a lot of team members and making a lot of decisions, should they have access to financials? Yes, probably they should. And even then, not access to necessarily signing for the bank account or anything like that, but should they see reports? Yeah, they have direct control over what happens there. But should the entire team have that? I personally don't think so.
I agree with you. And would that we had a world in which financial education was widespread and a world in which clinicians were more suited to understand it. But there is complexity in it. And I think there's also various elements of the training. As much as I love clinicians, elements of their own training sometimes make them hostile to financial considerations. And so to all of a sudden dump a whole bunch of financial considerations on them when their training sometimes makes them actively hostile is a recipe for not so much success.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think there are always a lot of forces at play. It's challenging to be a helper in a helping profession and want to help everyone and yet live in the reality that a business still needs money to run, right? Like if you want to get paid next Friday, like the business ultimately has to be able to collect money for the services that you do. And the benefits aren't free and the PTO and the office that you sit in and the snacks in the kitchen, like all of those things cost actual real money. And so like ultimately we do have to care about that
Yeah.
even in a helping profession. And that would be the case for surgeons and physical therapists and like all kinds of other helpers as well. Like that's just the economic reality.
In terms of some of the other central questions in therapist compensation, do you tend to favor dollars per session or split of revenue? Do you have a different opinion depending on the practice?
Um, Most common still, I would say, is percentage of revenue. But my favorite though would be dollar per session for a couple of different reasons. One is like I think when we start with a percentage, automatically the clinician is going to like, well, I'm bringing in this much money. So why am I only keeping, right? Like I'm going to use air quotes here. Why am I only keeping 60% when I'm bringing in all this money for you. Why wouldn't I keep more of it? Reason number two is when a clinician wants a raise, they don't consider the fact that you just got a raise from insurance and you're getting the same percentage of a higher amount. They don't consider that to be a raise. They want a bigger percentage, right? So you're always eroding your margin. And so for that reason, I'm not a huge fan of percentages. I think it still can work. It does kind of make it easy to run payroll because it's always very clear, like these are the dollars that came in. Here's a percentage, right? So it can be easier to calculate. But if we look on the other side at a flat fee per session or fee for service, I think that really helps control the ultimate cost, right? If you do get a raise from insurance, that can be completely separate from clinician getting a raise for merit, right? Those are two separate things. And so I like that. There is, however, a little bit of risk there in the sense that if your average fee per session changes and goes lower because the payer makes changes, that flat fee per session does not change, right? So if you have a panel that reimburses lower and all of a sudden you're seeing a lot more clients there, that can make things tricky, right? So we would want to revisit that average fee per session on a regular basis. If we were in a situation where the market was reducing average fee per session, which I mean, I have not actually seen it yet, but we are hearing a lot of rumbles of that potentially happening. That could be pretty bad for folks who pay with a flat fee per session, right? Whereas if you're paying a percentage, automatically they just, your clinicians are getting less, but you're not losing anything as a practice. So I think there's really pros and cons to each one. Today, this year, I'm not a fan of a salary, period, right? Unless you're looking at really leaders who have very clear expectations, who have longevity with the practice and a proven track record. I think salaries are abused very often by the clinicians who are just not, consistently not meeting their clinical goals. And legally, you still have to pay them the salary. So I would not go in that direction, period.
Do you ever help clients switch from percentage of revenue to flat?
All the time. Yeah. And it's something that has to be walked very, very delicately, right? Anytime you're making change, whether that's one method to another, contractor to employee, we always tell our clients to expect some attrition, right? Sometimes there won't be any, but I think it's best to go in expecting attrition because it's just any change can be hard for humans, right? Humans don't like change intrinsically. So like anytime you're bringing up a change, especially one with their money, like, oh, it's gonna, some people are just gonna not like that, right? So I think it has to be done really carefully with lots of thought and lots of room for all the feelings and explaining and meetings and all of that so that your team members understand exactly what's happening, right? I love a good side by side where they can see like, here's what it was, here's what it is now, like here's what you can expect. And even then, even when you do all things right, sometimes you will still lose people, right? But if it's the right thing for the business, it's still the right thing for the business. And sometimes that has to be okay. But yes, we do a lot of transition work on the planning side and the executing side, but also the reassurance side, right? Remind, like when a clinician says like, or an owner says like, I cannot believe how hard this is, and everyone has feelings like, you're doing the right thing. We've planned it. We know this is right. Keep going, right? Just that reassurance of, we know it's right and we know it's hard and keep going. You're doing amazing.
I mean, so often I see most of the practices that I had looked at that do the fee for service or the flat dollar per procedure, they started that way. They didn't switch midstream. So that journey of switching midstream, I think it evokes some of the same boundary issues that we talked about before, right?
Yeah.
And I can imagine that's not easy to do. So that's great that you're there to help practice owners sequence the journey.
Would you agree that percentage is still the most popular compensation method?
Yes, but I think that the fee for service is becoming more popular.
Okay.
That's my anecdotal hunch.
I would agree with that. I'd not say that it has taken the lead yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder also, I mean, it'd be interesting. Like, so I come from the legal industry, and the billable hour forever
Yeah.
has been the way that lawyers are paid. And that's changing slowly but surely. And maybe there comes a tipping point where enough of the market is on a new model that it's no longer frowned on. But until that happens, you probably do have to tread carefully so that you don't lose, quality clinicians that you really want to retain.
Yes, but I do think there's definitely a way to pay fairly in both of those situations, right? Where everyone feels good. I think that your clinicians should be able to really easily understand how much their money they're going to make and how they get paid, right? I do think clarity is really key. So for as an example, I'm not a big fan of tiered rates. Like I think that adds a lot of complexity and often the clinicians won't necessarily understand, like, well, why am I not at that rate? I was at that rate last pay period. How come I'm not there now? Right. And it just ends up creating more friction than helpful, right? It's often not incentivizing people to actually go up to the next tier or not long term at least. And it's just creating a lot of confusion instead. So, if you are paying on a percentage, I think clinicians should be able to see their revenue report so they can double check that that's accurate, right? And so depending on what you pick, like I think that kind of transparency is really important, not on the whole business, but just like here's my little universe, here's what I did. I should be able to tie my revenue report from the EHR to my paycheck. And that does make a lot of sense.
I agree with that as well. Any other? We're agreeing too much. I was looking for
We are
more
agreeing on
here.
okay, what can I don't know what we can disagree on.
I know.
I love when practices add benefits. I think benefits sometimes get added too early,
Mhm.
and often without consideration to actual cost, right? Where it's like, oh, well, I have to add this because I won't be competitive anymore. Like, is that always true? No, I think benefits can be a competitive advantage. I think beyond a certain point, there is an expectation of having benefits, but not all clinicians value benefits in the same way or need them. And sometimes you're just adding additional costs that don't really add a tangible value to the clinicians, and that's really too bad, right? If that's not something they wanted, I don't know, like you just spent a lot of money for something that they really don't care about.
We live in a universe of trade offs. And
Yes.
sometimes being more generous feels like a beautiful thing to do. It feels sometimes like an ethical obligation to a group practice owner. It feels like the quote unquote nice thing to do. And most group practice owners don't really survey their clinicians. So when you have really good data, you can understand what do clinicians actually want. And when you understand what they want, now you can be a bit more artful in determining where you want to be on all those trade-offs. And I agree,
Yes.
benefits are beautiful. And even if you survey your clinicians, it can be very hard to understand exactly what's going to retain them, even if they are on the verge of leaving, right? And so I think the business case for more benefits equals more retention. It's not quite so simple.
Yes, I would agree completely. And of course, there are some legally required benefits, right? Depending on the state, where you're in some states are required to offer sick time or paid time off or all of those. But like, we just have to build that into the equation, right? Because there is a cost ultimately to those things, and so we have to usually reduce something to make that possible. And so it's really just a trade off, but we have to understand what the numbers are in order to do that. But you can't just add, 2 weeks of PTO and everything's fine. Like I've seen the addition of PTO take down a practice. I have seen that happen where a client started working with us. They had just given everyone 2 weeks of paid time off a couple weeks before, which I wish they had waited. Then everyone took their PTO at the same time in the last 2 weeks of December. Business went under shortly after. Like there there's nothing to be done.
It is very, very sad.
Yeah.
Let's end on a happier
Okay.
note.
Yes, absolutely.
And let me ask you, when you're not building Green Oak, when you're not doing accounting for therapists, what's fun for you?
Oh, interesting question. I have been learning the cello for the last 2 years just for fun. I did not play as a teenager or a kid. I just wanted to learn the cello. So
And have you always had a musical interest, or is this new as well?
I played the piano as a child, but I always liked strings, and yeah, so that's what I do for fun. And I refuse to perform for anyone or anything. No concerts for me. I just want to do it for fun. That's all.
Notice I did not insist that you perform the cello on this podcast. We kept it solely to financials.
Of course.
Julie, thank you for coming on. Really, really interesting, meaty conversation. And I think these are truths that sometimes can be hard to talk about in our universe, but they're so, so important. I had a conversation just yesterday with a practice owner dealing with all of these issues, and it's just so important to get the word out about them. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I think you were expecting us to disagree way more than we did. So turns out we agreed on pretty much everything. But great, great, great conversation. Thank
And
you.
then what we talked about must be true.
Exactly. It must be true.